Welcome back to another edition of Higher Education Today. I'm your host, Steven Roy Goodman. I'm here in Umhlanga, South Africa, where we're going to be speaking about the U.S.-South Africa relationship. My guest today is Daniel Silke, who's a political analyst and an economic analyst. Welcome.
Thank you, Steve. Good to be with you.
Well, good to be with you, and thank you for coming. If I could ask you, I know that there's been a lot of discussion about the U.S.-South Africa relationship. Could you put this in some context? What is the U.S.-South Africa relationship now, and what has it been historically?
Yes, it's certainly a hot topic in South Africa right now and of relevance to just about everybody who lives here and frankly to surrounding countries as well. Look, South Africa, I suppose, has always had a close relationship with the US in general. But I think you have to go back to the pre-1994 days, and you have to go back to the days of the anti-apartheid struggle to understand the context of the governing African National Congress, the Party of Liberation, and how they saw the United States. Of course, the ANC always historically had relatively close links to anti-apartheid movements in the West, but also to anti-apartheid movements in the former Soviet Union and in China as well. And over many years and decades, the ANC received substantial assistance not from the West, but from Soviet Union and from China. But certainly that moved the ANC closer ideologically and diplomatically to the Soviet Union, and in so doing already set in motion a divergence between the ANC and Western countries, but in particular, I would argue, the United States. And the support that the ANC got during those liberation struggle years, I think, were very influential in setting the mental foreign policy of the ANC. Probably to this day, they just felt as though they were receiving assistance for the struggle, not necessarily from the US or from the West, to a large degree, but from the other entities that I've spoken about. And I think the context for the ANC even today is that the United States, whilst an important trading partner, a huge US corporate investment into South Africa right now, there is still, I think, something of a gulf within elements of the African National Congress who don't have a warm and fuzzy feeling towards the United States because of these historical issues, and prefer ultimately to develop closer relations with even the Russia of today and certainly the China of today as well.
Well, that's interesting because that is not what a lot of people in the West think. A lot of people in the West think about the support that a lot of Americans gave to the anti-apartheid struggle, and a lot of Americans think about their support of the struggle. And so it's interesting that the way you're framing this, because it's almost like there are two different thoughts going on at the same time.
Well, there were certainly, firstly, individuals in the United States, and there were any number of anti-apartheid organizations, and certainly when it comes to the anti-apartheid struggle on United States college campuses, that representation was very, very strong, and the ANC would absolutely recognize that. But I think at a higher level, at a government level, that's really what I'm talking about. And when we look at the big macro picture, the ANC, don't forget, the ANC historically, from an ideological perspective and from a policy and value perspective, has been more inclined to be associated with the 1960s sort of socialist revolution in Africa. The ANC has a component called the South African Communist Party that has always found favor and links with the Soviet Communist Party, Russia now, and certainly with China. So at a higher level, you can look at the historical connections between the ANC and, let us say, Russia or Soviet Union at an individual and organizational, NGO level for that matter. Of course, the United States played a very important role, and ultimately in the end, although it was quite controversial even within US domestic politics, was prepared to introduce economic sanctions against South Africa, when in fact the ANC were calling for this to isolate the apartheid regime.
Well, let's fast forward to now, though. So, as you know, there's been a crisis in U.S.-South Africa relations. What would you do if you were in Pretoria or you were in Washington and you were trying to lessen the tensions?
Well, there certainly have been tensions given the current administration's stance towards South Africa just in the course of the last month or so. These tensions, I certainly would argue myself, have been caused by a misinformation that has been conveyed to the current US administration. And it, of course, is very difficult and very complex to counter issues of who's telling the truth and whose side is which is the legitimate case of South Africa. I think that what South Africa intends to do from a diplomatic point of view is send through a relatively high-powered, multi-party delegation to Washington to try and see some of the key thought leaders in Washington and present an alternative vision to what perhaps has been already presented to elements within the current administration and have been so influential in moving the current administration into this particular view on South Africa. I think that's a reasonable step, and I think it's a logical step for South Africa to really engage. I mean, this is all about engagement. And I think that if there is misinformation, and for that matter, let's be honest about it, if political games are being played and political games get played, I'm a political analyst, Steve, political games get played whether you're in Washington or whether you're in South Africa. Believe me, there are vested interests and there are those who wish to direct a certain political discourse. I do think that communication is absolutely essential. And from the South African perspective in particular, a delegation comprising not just representatives of the majority party in South Africa, the African National Congress, but South Africa's business interests, of which there are many, non-governmental organizations, educational organizations as well, and of course critical service providers that provide social services in South Africa really need to come to Washington and engage the current US diplomatic corps entrusted with South African affairs over these troublesome issues. I think that's the only way to do it. From the US perspective, I think an open mind needs to be in place about South Africa. I think one should not take dogmatic or ideological positions about the country based upon perhaps sectional interests that have been presented in Washington. And I do think that the US administration needs to review and really needs to research adequately the current state of policy play in South Africa over the issue of land expropriation, which has been the headline issue seemingly for the Trump administration in their critique of South Africa. And certainly as a South African operating out of South Africa and someone who is an independent thinker within South Africa, my own analysis is that we don't have currently a land expropriation problem in South Africa. We don't have the dispossession of white-owned farms. It's simply not the case. Now, I think that it's good to have a discussion about these things, and what happens now may not necessarily be the case in the future. But I certainly do also strongly believe that this kind of open communication and dialogue and setting the record straight needs to be provided. And the US administration also needs to be able to trust who the messengers are from South Africa. It's very important that South Africa choose the right messengers to go to Washington. We have a government of national unity in South Africa. We have 10 political parties that now form our government. So there's no one view in South Africa anymore. It's good for our democracy here, by the way, because we discuss issues without having one majority party railroad every single decision-making process. And that's why representatives from these other political parties also need to be included in this particular discussion, which I think would be quite fruitful. But to make assumptions about South Africa based upon perhaps some narrow political interests coming out of South Africa, I think is unfortunate, and that has to be corrected.
Can universities or NGOs help in this way, in any way?
Well, I certainly think, of course they can, is the answer to that question. Universities, both in South Africa and frankly within the US, who have strong and close relationships between the two countries, really themselves need to step up to the plate. These are educational institutions that provide, of course, the future leaders, both in North America and in South Africa. And universities themselves are controversial, of course. Even under the current administration, universities are also battling political constraints, as we know right now. But from a South African context, our youth within South Africa coming through the higher educational system are going to be our future leaders, and they're going to be the continent's future leaders as well to a large degree. And from a US perspective, Africa is going to become, I would certainly argue, just on demographics alone, the most important continent in the world. We've looked at all the current demographic trends. We've looked at the rapid rate of the increases in middle classes on the African continent, the urbanization taking place on Africa. This all points to Africa being an economic powerhouse over the next 100 years, as I might add, population changes and reductions occur in most of the Western countries and frankly most of the rest of the world, including China. So engaging Africa and engaging Africa's youth is absolutely critical. And the last thing I would like to see is tension between the United States spill over into, let us say, South Africa looking away from the United States to other countries for even more assistance. I mean, the US will lose a degree of its influence in South Africa, and the message filters through to our neighbors as well. I might tell you, it's not just South Africa. I'm quite concerned that this level of tension will drive South Africa to look to find other friends and other sympathetic ears in other parts of the world, which I think undermines to a degree what the United States would actually like to achieve, which is a South Africa that really understands and works together with a major economic power like the US.
I hear what you're saying, but I wonder whether some people in Washington may say, well, why do we have to pay for our friends? Why do we have to pay for all of that? Why can't South Africans do that themselves?
Well, I think the African context perhaps is a little different to other parts of the world. This is a country with high levels of poverty. We've suffered under hundreds of years of, you may call it colonial or neo-colonial rule. Millions of South Africans have been dispossessed, and they simply cannot, they have not been able to, over the decades, they have not been able to secure substantial assets to be able to afford higher education, for that matter, or access to resources and access to proper training and education. And I think there is a definite case to be made. I mean, I understand the argument, absolutely. But at the same time, there's an absolute case to be made for assisting the developing world and providing the developing world with an audited type of assistance. I'm all in favor of audited assistance, I might add. I don't think you must just dole out cash to countries across the world or institutions across the world. But I do think that there's tremendous value in building trust and relationships and respect. You can call it that old cliche of soft power, and how soft power, I know there's an argument that soft power doesn't really get you anywhere, and it's cost certainly to the US taxpayer. And when you have high levels of debt in your own country, cutting costs is certainly important. But I think there is another side to the equation. And I think that it's not an issue of buying influence. But I do think that the goodwill coming out of the associations between the United States and South Africa, the subsidies, the AGOA benefits for that matter, trade benefits, the USAID benefits that we have seen, particularly in our healthcare sector, where we are unable to fund the level of research into HIV/AIDS from our own budget up until now. We've now got to scramble for cash. We've just had our own budget here in South Africa. We simply don't have enough cash to be able to maintain those very high levels of research that the USAID has been able to inject into South Africa. These are all important issues, not just for South Africa. They serve people, there's a humanity aspect to it, and of course they serve the continent. And as I've said, I think this continent is going to be critically important from a human point of view and from a global national security point of view. There's a new scramble for Africa here. Chinese want in, the Gulf countries want in, the Europeans want in, and I don't think that it's in the interest of the United States not to be able to fight that battle. And that battle will be fought not just through transactional relations, but it will be fought also through aid, assistance, and building communities.
Well, let's assume that's all true. Do you think the South African negotiators might be able to say something along the lines of, perhaps there should be some sort of profit sharing from some of the research that goes on about HIV?
Well, I think there has already been a degree of profit sharing on that particular issue, because as I understand it, that HIV research benefits the continent. It's not held back for specific institutions or for the South African state. So there already is that. And I think if you can perhaps quantify that kind of, let us say, profit sharing in where aid money goes, I think that would be a start. I think it is important for South Africa to understand what it has to give back in order to get those benefits. I mean, I think that's fairly reasonable. And I think it is fairly reasonable to expect countries to audit properly the monies that they receive and the benefits they receive. And I think also South Africa has to understand the domestic imperatives within the United States in terms of manufacturing, in terms of job creation, in terms of changing the broader economy in the US vis-a-vis what South Africa can produce and goes into the United States as well. So we here also have to be cognizant of domestic US imperatives, not just ideological issues, but domestic US imperatives. You could very well argue that this huge budget deficit in the United States, spiraling debt in the United States, yeah, that has to be paid back at some point. That can really upset that US economy in future. So the handouts, the expenditure from the United States probably has to be reined in to some degree. But I think there's a way and means of doing it, and there are aspects of cooperation that serve the interests of the broader continent and humanity, and shouldn't just be seen for narrow national interests.
But when you see the administration, the South African team no doubt is going to present those narrow interests, because it's a discussion and a negotiation.
I think so, but I think that negotiation team would be well advised to present a bigger picture. I think they need to understand the context of the United States and from where the current administration is coming from. If you don't understand that context, you probably will hit your head against a brick wall. So my advice to the South African delegation is to well understand those economic imperatives that have shifted policy in Washington in the last couple of months or so. And I think South Africa too have to present that more broader cost-benefit analysis to Washington in terms of what this aid and assistance and benefits can do. Just by not having some of our agricultural products exported into the United States will exacerbate our already very high unemployment problem within South Africa. And we have foreign workers who come into South Africa as well. Those workers will find it just that little bit more difficult to make ends meet. They're already in trouble. So I think that these broader issues plus the micro issues together need to be presented it's a framework about humanity. It isn't just about sort of hard-nosed politics. We've also got to look at ourselves, Steve, in South Africa. We also have to. We can't waste resources. And we also have to understand that aspects of our own foreign policy and aspects of our own domestic policy in South Africa need to perhaps be tweaked, need to be a little bit less radical if we are to go to a major player like the United States and make our case for their assistance. There is a two-way street in this.
And do you think the government of national unity has the political ability to do that?
Well, it certainly has more of the ability than just an ANC delegation, as would have been the case had the ANC got 50% plus one in the last election. A multi-party delegation certainly would add substantial credibility to the South African story. But we need automobile manufacturers to go to Washington as well. Our automobile industry is a critical economic driver in the Eastern Cape area of South Africa. And if we lose if we lose market share, and it's very possible because of tariffs, not just on South African vehicles, but coming on European vehicles as well, that will increase poverty levels in the Eastern Cape of South Africa. And it's unlikely that we're going to make up that slack by exporting into the EU or exporting elsewhere for that matter as well. So the negative effects on our own economy, on our own people, is critical to convey to Washington. So private sector needs to be involved. The agricultural sector, already a sector that has been highlighted by current thinking in Washington as being really on the back foot in South Africa because of the land expropriation policy. Well, there are many different agricultural organizations in South Africa. They don't all speak with one voice, and they don't all believe in the same trajectory for South Africa. They don't even analyze policy in South Africa in the same way. And these differing voices need also to be part of this delegation.
But let's assume all of that's true. But the United States sector in, let's say, car manufacturing is also hurting. So it would be a hard argument from my perspective as an American to hear a delegation saying we need help for a South African or another car manufacturer when the American manufacturers are hurting.
Absolutely, and I think that's why our view, those who go to Washington have to be cognizant of that kind of line that is going to be presented. But it goes back to the original issue. Africa certainly has relative weak economies in comparison to North America. We in South Africa in particular have very, very high unemployment. We've got over 50% unemployment of young South Africans. The opportunity for young South Africans to get a job is really limited. Yes, we should have better policies in South Africa, indeed. Our policy framework, and that's a domestic issue in South Africa, should not have come to the point where we have such high levels of unemployment. But we do, and the power and assistance that the United States can provide is not just to enable that young kid to get a job in an automobile factory, but it is also goodwill, it's humanitarian, and it builds relationships. And to me, the future of the world is going to be about building relationships, and in particular, building relationships with Africa. Remember, Europe is Europe, Asia in a sense is Asia, North America is North America, but Africa is up for grabs from a geopolitical and geostrategic point of view. And I'm a great believer that Africa already has extensive economic interests with China. The graph of China's involvement in Africa has gone through the roof. The United States has been lagging behind for the better part of the last 10, 15 years. Whatever the arguments about the US domestic economy, we also need to understand the geopolitical and strategic value of Africa, the humanitarian aspects that apply in Africa, and then, of course, as a South African, the domestic economic hardships in my own country.
And if you were advising Parliament right now in terms of the economic changes that they should make, what would you advise?
Well, in South Africa, I think we have made numerous policy errors over the last 30 years. And I think when it comes to there are various issues. We've come very late to the party to understand that public-private partnerships are critical in South Africa. We've come very late to the party in accepting that state-run enterprises in South Africa have largely been a failure within the country, have cost the country. And our inability to balance our own budget is actually as a result of the wastage of resources and the poor management of state-owned enterprises. But it goes further than that. We've adopted a policy of black economic empowerment in South Africa. You may want to call it affirmative action if you want to from a sort of a North American perspective. Now, this hasn't assisted the broad development of young black South Africans. The benefits of black economic empowerment have largely been very narrowly conveyed to elites, politically connected elites. And the statistics of the state of our economy, the drop in our per capita income, the jobless rate, is certainly, I think, evidence that this BEE policy, as we call it, has simply not worked. So I think we need to tweak that. We need to make it, it's onerous, it's a negative on foreign investors. It adds red tape to the ability of foreign companies to invest in South Africa. And that's something that, in my mind, needs to be tweaked. 30 years after the end of apartheid, we shouldn't need that anymore, especially when it has been a hindrance to South African economic growth.
And what about the universities? What would you advise universities in South Africa to do right now?
Well, I think once again, communication is critical between our universities. We still, I'm pleased to say, have extremely good universities with a global reputation and substantial international linkages as well. Those universities have to, of course, engage their US counterparts as closely as they can. And I think fact-finding groups between the two countries and fact-finding student groups in particular are critical in alleviating these misunderstandings and misinformation that does seem to be prevalent in the current debate between the US and South Africa. So it's all about communication, in my view. But of course, it takes two to tango. It takes both the US authorities to be willing to listen to a broad range of opinion, whether it's from an automobile manufacturer or whether it's from an academic group or an academic or a university chancellor. And frankly, in South Africa too, we have to understand some of the issues you've raised here with me and those constraints that are now evident within the US economic and political discourse and how that does impact the relationship between the two countries. So an open mind, of which universities should be the chief proponents of, is critical on both sides.
And we only have a few more minutes, but what about tourism? How do you think the tourism sector can get involved?
Well, we've had quite dynamic growth from the North American tourism sector into South Africa over the last 2 years or so. And we all know, and I think I know you well enough, Steve, to know that travel is the best education. I shouldn't say this in a higher education program, but travel is the best education. So the integration and the exposure that travel offers to North Americans coming to us here and vice versa, absolutely critical. And I'm just nervous that this kind of spat between our two countries can also lead to a reluctance on the part of some to visit South Africa. There's a certain negativity about South Africa in the public discourse, which concerns me. And I would hope also that this doesn't affect the potential of visas from South Africans, and young South Africans in particular, who wish to spend time in the United States. So I would hope that these issues do not affect the tourism industry in general, but tourism and the arrivals of foreigners into South Africa can only enhance the understanding of our country, our history, and the message goes back home.
Well, Daniel, thank you for your time today. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
And if you would like additional information about Daniel Silke, please go to danielsilke.com. If you'd like to send a note to me at the show, please go ahead and do so by sending an email to highereducationtoday@topcolleges.com. And thank you for watching. We will continue to bring you quality discussions about important matters in today's college and university world. I'm Steven Roy Goodman, and you've been watching Higher Education Today.